Imagine walking through the desert under a scorching sun and suddenly spotting something impossible, an intense flame, burning without being consumed. Something like that does not obey the laws of nature. Something like that has a purpose. And that is exactly what happened to Moses. What seemed like a surreal vision was, in fact, the direct calling of God. Now, pause for a moment and ask yourself, what if that same God wanted to speak to you today? What would he say? How would you react? The story of the burning bush is not just an event from the past, it carries a revelation that can transform your life today. And what God said at that moment still echoes now, I am who I am. But what does that phrase really mean? Stay with me until the end of this video, because this message could completely change the way you see the world. Moses approached that astonishing vision without understanding what was happening. The bush was burning but was not consumed. Something supernatural stood before him, and at that moment, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. Then, he heard a voice. Moses, Moses! His heart must have raced. Who was calling him? He was alone in the desert, with no one around. But that voice was not human. It came from within the flames and carried an authority that made his whole body tremble. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. At that moment, Moses realized that this was not just an extraordinary vision. It was an encounter with God. And here is something that few people notice in this story. The burning bush was not there by chance. God could have spoken to Moses in any other way, but he chose this symbol. A fire that burned without destroying. This teaches us something profound. Many times, we think of fire only as destruction, pain, and suffering. But in the presence of God, fire purifies without consuming. It transforms without destroying. And this is not just a story from the past. God continues to call people even today. But are we paying enough attention to hear his voice? At that moment, Moses was simply tending his father-in-law's sheep. An ordinary day, with no expectation that his life would take a drastic turn. But when God enters the story, everything changes. And what happens next is even more astonishing. Moses tries to understand what he is experiencing. He feels small in the face of that calling. And then, he asks a question that reveals his insecurity. Who am I to go to Pharaoh and free the people of Israel? Have you ever felt that way? Too small for a great challenge? Incapable of doing something that seems beyond your strength? But God did not respond by praising Moses' qualities. He did not say, you are strong, you are intelligent, you have incredible skills. No. God's answer was simple but powerful, I will be with you. And that changes everything. Because when God is present, our weaknesses do not matter. Our fears do not matter. The size of the mission does not matter. If he calls us, he also equips us. Then Moses asks another question. Perhaps the most important one in this entire conversation. What if they ask me who sent me? What should I say? And at that moment, God reveals something that would change history forever. I am who I am. This phrase is one of the greatest mysteries in the Bible. What did God mean by that? The meaning behind this response goes far beyond what we can imagine. Because it is not just a name. I am means that God is eternal. That he has always existed and will always exist. He was not created. He does not depend on anything to be God. He simply is. While the gods of Egypt needed temples, statues, and sacrifices to be recognized, the God of Israel needed none of that. He is absolute. He is existence itself. And this revelation did not remain only in the Old Testament. Centuries later, Jesus would use this same expression to identify himself. In John 8 verse 58, he declared, before Abraham was, I am. With these words, Jesus was saying something profound. He was not just a prophet, not just a teacher, not just a man. He was God himself. And this revelation had a massive impact. The religious leaders of the time were furious because they understood exactly what Jesus was saying. He was placing himself on the same level as God. And this is the truth that changes everything. The God who spoke to Moses in the burning bush is the same God who came into the world in flesh and blood to redeem us. He is not an abstract concept. He is real. He is involved in our lives. And if he called Moses, he may also be calling you. But are we ready to listen? What happens after this conversation between Moses and God is incredible. Because the calling that Moses received was not easy. He had to return to Egypt and face Pharaoh. He had to free an entire people. He had to challenge the greatest empire of that time. But the real issue was not Moses' strength. It was the strength of the one who sent him. And that is the key that can transform your life as well. How many times do we feel incapable? How many times do we think we are not good enough? But the truth is that our confidence should not be in ourselves, but in the one who calls us. Moses had fears. He tried to refuse the calling. But God did not choose him because of his abilities. He chose him because he had a plan. And believe this, God also has a plan for you. If you are enjoying this message, keep watching, because in the next section, we will dive even deeper into Moses' journey and see how God demonstrated his power in a way that no one could deny. Moses heard the voice of God and received an impossible mission. Return to Egypt, face Pharaoh, and free an entire people from slavery. One man alone against the greatest empire of that time. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But here is something we need to understand. When God calls, he himself provides the resources to fulfill the purpose. Yet Moses was still insecure. He looked at his own limitations and saw only difficulties. He was not a warrior. He was not an experienced leader. And on top of that, he had a speech problem. So he questioned, "But Lord, what if they do not believe me? What if they say that you did not appear to me?" God responded with a demonstration of power. He told Moses to throw his staff on the ground. Immediately, the staff turned into a snake. Moses was startled and stepped back. But God commanded him to grab the snake by the tail, and when he obeyed, the creature turned back into a staff. This was not just a trick. It was a lesson. God was showing that he has absolute control over all things, even what seems dangerous or threatening. But Moses continued to hesitate. "Lord, I am not good with words. I have trouble speaking." And here, God gave a powerful response. Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with you and teach you what to say. Moses was looking at himself, but God wanted him to focus on what truly mattered, the Creator of the universe. And this is a great lesson for us. How many times do we look at our own flaws and think we are not capable? But God does not depend on our abilities. He equips those he calls. Even so, Moses hesitated once more and asked God to send someone else. Then, God allowed his brother, Aaron, to go with him to help him speak. Now, Moses had no more excuses. It was time to head to Egypt. And here begins one of the most astonishing stories in the entire Bible. Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh and spoke the words that would go down in history. "Thus says the Lord, let my people go." But Pharaoh laughed. He did not take it seriously. Who was this God that he should obey him? Egypt had its own gods. And Pharaoh was not willing to lose his slaves so easily. And here comes another important detail. God's power would be demonstrated in a way that no one could ignore. God sent the 10 plagues upon Egypt. Each plague was a direct response to the Egyptian gods. The Nile, which the Egyptians worshipped as a source of life, turned into blood. The frogs, which represented fertility, invaded everything and became a plague. Lice, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness. And finally, the last and most terrible of all, the death of the firstborn. At that moment, Pharaoh finally gave in. The suffering was too great, and he allowed the Israelites to leave. But the story does not end here. Shortly after freeing the people, Pharaoh regretted his decision and decided to chase after the Israelites with his army. Imagine the scene: the Hebrews stood before the Red Sea, with no way out. Behind them, an enraged army. Ahead, a vast expanse of water. Panic spread. The people began to complain to Moses, thinking they would die there. And then, once again, God showed that nothing is impossible for him. Moses raised his staff, and the sea parted. Just like that. The waters formed two great walls, and the Israelites crossed through on dry ground. When the Egyptian army tried to follow them, the waters returned to normal, and Pharaoh's soldiers were completely destroyed. God's victory was absolute. But this story is not just an ancient account. It teaches us that we often find ourselves in similar situations. How many times do we feel trapped, with no way out? Problems on all sides and no solution in sight? But just as God parted the Red Sea for Moses and the Israelites, He can open paths in your life where there seems to be no escape. What happens after this great deliverance is a moment of celebration. The people of Israel sang and danced in gratitude to God. But soon after, the real test began, the journey through the desert. And this is where we will see how the people's faith would be tested intensely. So, if you want to know how this journey continues and what we can learn from it, stay with me until the end. And take this moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps spread this message to more people and strengthens this project. Now, get ready, because in the next section, we will see how God cared for His people in the midst of difficulties and how these lessons can transform your life. The Israelites had just witnessed one of the greatest miracles in history. The sea parted before their eyes, they crossed safely, and Pharaoh's army was destroyed. It was complete victory, the confirmation that God was in control. The people celebrated, sang, and danced. Moses and his sister Miriam led the worship, exalting the God who had freed them from slavery. But the euphoria did not last long. 3 days later, they walked through the desert without finding water. Thirst began to set in, and when they finally reached a place where there was water, they realized it was bitter and impossible to drink. The joy of deliverance turned into despair. And then something happened that would be repeated many times throughout their journey in the desert. The people complained. They began to grumble against Moses, saying, "What are we going to drink?" But look at Moses' reaction. Instead of panicking along with the people, he did what should always be the first response in any difficulty: he prayed. He cried out to God. And the answer came immediately. God showed him a piece of wood, and when Moses threw it into the water, the bitterness disappeared, and the water became drinkable. This was another sign that God not only delivers, but also sustains. But this would be just the first of many tests the Israelites would face. Shortly after, another problem arose: hunger. They were in the middle of the desert, far from Egypt, with no crops or stored food. And once again, they started complaining. Why did the Lord bring us here? In Egypt, we had meat and bread. Now we are going to die of hunger in the desert. It seems unbelievable, doesn't it? God had just performed astonishing miracles, yet the people were already longing for slavery. This teaches us something important: trusting in God is not always easy, especially when we go through difficult times. But God, in His patience, decided to show once again that He was the provider. And then one of the most well-known miracles of the Old Testament took place: the sending of manna. Every morning, the people found on the ground a type of bread that God sent from heaven. They could collect enough for each day, but could not store it for the next day, except on Fridays, when they received double so they could rest on the Sabbath. This detail teaches us something essential: God wanted the people to learn to trust Him daily. It was not about stockpiling food and feeling secure on their own. It was about learning to depend on God every day. And the miracle did not stop there. When the people longed for meat, God sent quails. When they were thirsty again, Moses struck a rock with his staff, and water flowed from it. The message was clear: God does not only deliver, He walks alongside His people and provides for all their needs. But even with all of this, the Israelites continued to doubt and complain. And this lack of trust led to one of the most significant moments of their journey: the arrival at Mount Sinai. It was there that God decided to reveal something even greater to the people. God called Moses to the top of the mountain to give him something that would guide the Israelites for the rest of history, the 10 Commandments. The mountain was covered by a thick cloud, lightning flashed across the sky, and the sound of a trumpet echoed. It was a moment of reverence, a direct encounter between God and his people. The commandments that God gave to Moses were not just rules, they were a covenant, an alliance between God and the Israelites. But while Moses was on top of the mountain receiving divine instructions, something unbelievable was happening below. The people, impatient with Moses' delay, decided to take matters into their own hands. They convinced Aaron to make a golden calf and began worshipping it as if it were God himself. Yes, the same people who had seen the sea part and had eaten bread from heaven were now bowing before an idol made by human hands. This teaches us a hard but real truth: faith can easily be replaced by impatience and the search for immediate solutions. When Moses came down and saw what was happening, he was furious. He broke the tablets of the law and confronted the people. God was also angry and said he could destroy them all and start over with Moses. But at that moment, something incredible happened. Moses interceded for the people. He asked God to have mercy and not destroy the Israelites. And God listened. This shows us the power of intercession. Moses, a single man, was able to change the fate of an entire nation because he stood before God in prayer. And even after this betrayal, God renewed his covenant with the people and rewrote the 10 Commandments. The journey through the desert continued for 40 years. Throughout this entire time, God never abandoned them. During the day, a cloud guided the people. At night, a pillar of fire showed the way. What do we learn from this story? First, that God does not call us to an easy journey, but to a life of trust in him. Second, that he never leaves us alone. And third, that even when we fail, he is ready to restore us. But this journey was not over yet. In the next part, we will see how the people finally reached the promised land and what we can learn from this long-awaited moment. The journey through the desert was far from easy. The people of Israel had received the 10 Commandments, experienced extraordinary miracles, and seen God act in supernatural ways. Yet, their faith was constantly tested. The 40 years in the desert were not just a punishment. They were a period of learning and transformation. The people needed to understand that they depended on God for every step of the way. And then, the long-awaited moment arrived. They stood before the promised land. But before they could enter, God gave a clear order: send 12 spies to observe the land and bring back a report. The spies spent 40 days exploring Canaan, and when they returned, they brought concerning news. Yes, the land was good, full of fruit and abundance, but it was also inhabited by strong nations, fortified cities, and giants. And that is when fear took hold of the people. 10 of the spies said that conquering the land was impossible, that they were like grasshoppers compared to the inhabitants of Canaan. But 2 men saw the situation differently. Joshua and Caleb said, "If God has promised us this land, then he himself will give us the victory." But the people did not listen. Instead of trusting God, they began to complain, saying they would rather have died in Egypt. At that moment, God made a drastic decision: none of those who doubted would enter the promised land. All those who complained and rebelled would die in the desert, and only their children would inherit the promise. Joshua and Caleb, the only ones who had trusted, would be the only ones of that generation to see Canaan. Thus, Israel had to wander in the desert for another 40 years until the entire unbelieving generation had passed away. For decades later, the time for conquest had finally come. Moses, the great leader, did not enter the promised land because, in a moment of anger, he had disobeyed God. But before departing, he passed the leadership to Joshua, the one who, along with Caleb, had trusted in the divine promise. Then God gave Joshua a clear instruction: be strong and courageous. Just as I was with Moses, I will be with you. And then, another great miracle happened. At the Jordan River, God repeated what he had done at the Red Sea. The waters parted, and the people crossed on dry ground. It was a new beginning. The first great battle took place in Jericho. And here is the surprising detail: the military strategy used was not conventional. God commanded the Israelites to march around the city in silence for 6 days, and on the 7th day, to walk around the wall 7 times, blowing trumpets and shouting. At the exact moment, the walls of Jericho collapsed without them having to lift a sword. This demonstrated something very important: victories did not depend on the strength of the people, but on the power of God. From that moment on, the Israelites conquered territory after territory, seeing God's promises being fulfilled before their eyes. After many battles, Canaan finally belonged to the people of Israel. God had fulfilled his word. The journey of Moses and the people of Israel is full of valuable lessons. First, we see that God has a purpose for each of us. Moses never imagined he would be a leader, but God called and equipped him. Second, we learn that faith is essential. The Israelites wavered many times because they focused on obstacles instead of trusting in the God who walked with them. Third, we understand that God is faithful. He promised a land to his people, and despite the delay caused by their unbelief, he fulfilled his promise. And finally, this story reminds us that the presence of God makes all the difference. He not only delivers, but also sustains, guides, and never abandons his own. If you made it this far, it means this message has touched your heart. So, take this moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue bringing content like this to you. And there is another amazing video waiting for you on the screen right now. Click and keep learning. May God bless you, and see you next time.